اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد 𝗟𝗲𝗁𝐴 Alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us again to be here in the majlis of Noor, Khair, Barakah, and Allah has honored us again to have Seerah Abdal Hakim Murad. Inshallah ta'ala, I think most of us know who he is, and at the moment he's professor at the University of Cambridge and has been involved in da'wah and has had the opportunity to sit down with the great ulama of Habaib anhum, like 𝗕𝗲𝗰𝐁 𝗲𝗲𝗁. And I think the session will be from 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock inshallah ta'ala. There will be questions at the end inshallah ta'ala. I think written questions at the end inshallah ta'ala.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب يسر وأعن يا كريم وافتح بالحق إنك الفتاح العليم. The Muslim is required always to be a person of hikmah, of wisdom, and this is something for which we are particularly well equipped by the lawgiver who has sculpted our particular pattern of response to the time and place appointed for the final ummah, to make things easier for us, not to make things harder. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that we are to be the last of the ummahs, akhir al-ummah, and also the best of ummahs, 𝗟𝗲𝗁𝗁𝐴 ukhrijat lin-nas. And this might seem a tall order, given the nature of the times. How is it possible for an ummah to be appointed to live in the worst of times, but at the same time to be the best of the ummahs that has ever been? لَا يُكَلِّفُ اللَّهُ نَفْسًا إِلَّا وُسْعَهَا. Allah charges a soul only with that which it can bear. How is it that the burden laid upon the shoulders of this ummah is apparently to be greater than the burden carried by any earlier community? Those of you who were listening to me last week will have heard me trying to say a few things about the balance that is required. Namely that the architecture of the sunnah is like the building of a ship, which is designed to be simple and yet sturdy to tide us through this most stormy point in the passage of Bani Adam until we finally reach the harbour. The pilot then being not ourselves and not even the ijma' of our scholars, but Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam himself. And we are sailing through these choppy waters. And I was trying to indicate some of the ways in which the sunnah really gives away this end time aspect of our tradition. And we saw that one aspect of this is that the works of this ummah are fixed. Earlier ummahs had sharia. Everybody's been given shir'atan wa minhaja, a law and a mapped out way. And one of the qualities of the law of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is that it is immutable until the end of time. no other ummah worships as its founder worshipped. Most of them are not even aware that this might be a good thing to do. But the ummah of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam still follows the principle, صَلُّوا كَمَا رَأَيْتُمُونِي أُصَلِّي, pray as you have seen me pray, and so forth with the other obligations. Certainly this is one of the khasa'is of the ummah, one of its unique traits, and one of the evidences of this ayah, the best of ummahs brought out for mankind. Somehow or other, despite the extraordinarily abrasive, corrosive conditions of the bland, boring, but in many ways demonically materialistic modern world, Islam itself, if not all of its adherents, has kept its head. Islam is not corroded, whatever the state of the Muslims might be. People might have jumped out of the lifeboat, but the lifeboat is still afloat, and that ultimately is what matters. And it is the function of the ulama to keep it afloat and to repair it, not to try and turn it into something else in accordance with the imperfect perceptions of the age, until such time as people get the message and want to get back on board. And this, I think, is a very helpful way of approaching the seerah. Because what is happening as the seerah unfolds and each of the years of the ministry of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam has a particular quality, very distinct from the year that went before. The ulama of seerah have often noted this, and of course the individual years actually have names that give us a sense of the fragrance of the quality of the unpacking of the Muhammadan revelation at that particular juncture. And we can learn much about the purpose and the structure of Islam just by looking at the tartib, the ordering of the events. The first things come first. And as we look around ourselves and recognize that sharia is big, and our capacities are limited, and as we look around with the normal human urge to judge others, we need to apply this divine wisdom that is part of the process of Quranic revelation itself, part of the fact that the Quran is revealed munajjama, progressively, that we look at people on the basis of the extent to which they are applying those things that came first, not those things that came last. Now, of course, 𝗟𝗲𝗂𝐴 أَكْمَلْتُ لَكُمْ دِينَكُمْ. Right at the end, today I have completed for you your religion. The completion is the sharia with all the nuts and bolts complete. The fundamental rich quarry from which the ulama subsequently hew the form that the law is to take to make it authentic in the varying circumstances of men. But what is important is what comes first. The fard ayn tends to come before the fard kifaya. And the fard kifaya tends to be the thing that is necessarily first lost sight of, because we can't hold it any longer. The circumstances of the age, in many cases, through no fault of ordinary Muslim communities, do not allow us to hold on to that thing. Circumstances simply cannot bear it. So we note that the consistent message of the hadiths that speak of the fitan, the seditions at the end of time, what those hadith agree on is that is the time for keeping one's head down. That is the way of the awliya and the ulama at that time. Kun hinsa min ahlazi baytik, be like a piece of furniture in your house. Don't go out there with your placard shouting jihad, jihad, and stand in a futile way in front of the steamroller. Hadiths are telling us not to do that. And this again is part of wisdom. We are not to extend our hands to destruction. But what will be important in those days will be the indispensable individual obligations. And it is on that basis that we should be framing our view of the rest of the Ummah. It is futile, unnecessary, unrealistic and unfair to judge Muslim communities for not doing everything. The correct way of judging, if we feel we need to judge, is to look at things from the other end and say, alhamdulillah, they're doing something. That should be the basis of judging people in a time when everything has become difficult. When 𝗕𝗲𝗰𝘂𝗃𝗃 𝗂𝗲𝗃𝗃, when the man who is holding his religion is like a man holding a hot coal, when it is all difficult, then instead of saying, why doesn't he have a beard? It's more Islamic under those circumstances to say, alhamdulillah, he comes to the mosque. And this is the way of the ulama, the traditional ulama, where you sit with them, that is the judgment they apply. The sound hadith says, addressing the Sahaba, إِنَّكُمْ فِي زَمَانٍ مَنْ تَرَكَ مِنْكُمْ عُشْرَ مَا أُمِرَ بِهِ هَلَكَ. You are in a time in which someone who abandons a tenth of what is being commanded to do will be destroyed. وَسَيَأْتِي عَلَى النَّاسِ زَمَانٌ مَنْ عَمِلَ مِنْكُمْ عُشْرَ مَا أُمِرَ بِهِ نَجَا. But there shall come to people a time when those who do a tenth of what they have commanded to do will be saved. Not grounds for complacency. How many of us can really put our hands on our hearts and say, we are doing a tenth of what the Sahaba did? I hope not many of us would be arrogant enough to make that claim. But what the point of the hadith is, don't overjudge in times when that's not appropriate. And the consequence of that is, don't panic when the circumstances of the age seem to be dark. Written into the very logic of the tartib of the Seerah is a clue to retaining equilibrium under these difficult modern circumstances. And we are the ones who can be amongst those who were praised by the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam when he said, 𝗕𝗲𝗰𝗂𝗂𝗿 𝗂𝗲𝗴𝘂. Blessed be the strangers. The strangers are those who did not see the Sahaba or the Tabi'een, but come at a great historical gulf from them, and yet they're still trying to do something. 𝗕𝗲𝗰𝗂𝗂𝗿, those who have every human excuse not to do anything and just to sink without trace in the dunya, whose flood is constantly rising, but who somehow manage to keep even just some small part of them above water. Those are the ghurabat, strangers, and blessed are they. Now this is from the wisdom of prophecy. One of the meanings of nubuwwah is indeed prediction, knowing what's going to happen, and one of the most fundamental gifts that is given to us by Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is guidance on what to do when things turn out badly. What we don't get in our scriptures is some kind of detailed Nostradamus-like timetable for the next 1,000 or so years. In the year 624 of the Hijrah, the Mongols will do whatever. We can't have that because it involves us in intolerable paradoxes. And it also reduces the opportunity for Muslims in those times to be in a genuine state of ibtila. Allah is giving them surprises in every year, fitness in every year, and He wants to see how we behave. So it cannot be the function of a prophet to say, in the year 1423 of the Hijrah, or 1424 of the Hijrah, such and such a crisis will erupt and you should have this response. Because that's to detract from our human autonomy and will turn us into little more than robots. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. We have ennobled the descendants of Adam. And we are required not to be like the jamadats, the mineral solids, or like the hayawanat, the other living animals. We are something categorically different. And the basis of that is niyyah and patience and hope and other things that cannot inhere in any creature that does not have aql. So one function of prophecy is not, in our understanding, to give us a detailed calendar. What we are given is certain generic warnings about the kind of thing that we should be preparing for, because that is useful. And that is a test, rather than taking the test away from us. What we are also given is very clear instructions on how we are to understand history, which is a process of entropy. لا يأتي زمان إلا والذي بعده شر منه. According to the hadith, no age comes but that it is followed by one still worse. It's part of the logic of the differentiation between the Salaf and the Khalaf. After the Khalaf, you just get the Mahdi. That's the only point. Restoration. So, if we read between the lines of the Seerah, and we look at what is fundamentally going on, the structure behind the events, we can see a pattern of divine wisdom that, if we are patient and insightful enough to discern it, will give us wisdom for our situation. So, part of the message of the Seerah has to be, don't rush to judge. Judge yourself by all means, although the ulama always urge us not to be too hard on ourselves, lest our shoulders, which have become narrow, will break. And we cannot be expected to carry burdens like those that were carried by those who were before us. But what we are particularly directed to avoid is to point accusing fingers around us and to say, that person is not doing such and such a thing. Rather than saying, because of the evil of this age, and the fact that his parents didn't have access to a proper Islamic upbringing, and because of the fact that I haven't bothered to help him out, he is not doing that particular thing. The prophetic way is not the way of blame. The prophetic way is looking for what is best, which is the principle of husn al-dhann, giving people the benefit of the doubt, which is absolutely fundamental in our ethics, in our 𝐈𝐦𝐩𝐸. Husn al-dhann of Allah's intentions, and not blaming Him implicitly for the state of the age, because everything is unfolding according to His wisdom, and there is no superior wisdom. And also husn al-dhann of other people, assuming that there are very few people who are really genuinely evil. Most people, in fact, are more or less like ourselves, but just have not had the providential success that might put them in the situation that might have kept us out of a certain degree of trouble. But that's the only difference. So, when we see somebody who is in a state of ibtila, our reaction should not be naughty, naughty, but should rather be alḥamdulillāh. This is part of the wisdom of the Seerah as well. What is the dua that we say when we see somebody who is in a state of ibtila, whether it's physical misfortune or spiritual misfortune? Alhamdulillah, alladhi āfānā mimma ibtalāhu bih, wa faddalana ala kathīrin mimman khalaqa tafḍīlā. This is a very good dua to learn, because ibtila is widespread in our age. Alhamdulillah, praise to Allah who saved me from that which He is trying that person with, and has given us merit over many. And that's the way to defeat the shaytan. Because the shaytan, when he takes your finger and points it in blame at somebody else, is taking your other finger and pointing it in an approving way at yourself. It's just a way of saying, I am superior. 9 times out of 10 when we condemn people, we think we're engaging in some kind of amr bil ma'ruf. In fact, what's going on deep down is praise of the self, which is even more tempting than condemning someone else. But to adopt this kind of prophetic ethic as exampled in this statement that we are required to repeat when we see somebody in a state of ibtila, is to put both of those fingers down and not to attribute blame to that person, because you have no idea why he is as he is. You have absolutely no way of assessing his past, his particular trajectory, the accident of birth, the circumstances of his soul, level of intelligence, and the rest. And certainly not to point at yourself as being superior, because that's, the ni'mah of Islam is itself entirely from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our hearts are between 2 fingers of the Rahman, and He turns the hearts, يُقَلِّبُهَا كَمَا شَاءَ, He turns them as He wills. And the heart is in a particularly vulnerable state in times of fitna, because one of the ways in which you can see that you're in an age of fitna is that people are moving spiritually a lot, and generally the movement is downwards, but there can be positive things happening as well. It's an age of ferment. Things sink, things rise to the surface because there is a process of corruption going on. يُصْبِحُ الرَّجُلُ فِيهَا 𝗕𝗲𝗰 𝗂𝗖𝐻 مُؤْمِنًا. In those days, a person will rise in the morning as an unbeliever, and in the evening he will be a believer. And it's the other way around. وَيُمْسِي مُؤْمِنًا وَيُصْبِحُ كَافِرًا. In the evening he goes to bed as a kafir, gets up as a Muslim. And that's one of the qualities of our information age. People are moving in all directions, bumping into each other, heading for this, heading away from that. Everybody's in a state of sort of Brownian motion. And when people are like that, and buffeted by all kinds of things that you can't see, the wisdom of the Seerah is, in an age such as this, breathing air such as ours, it's amazing that anybody is still alive. There is so much pollution. So the response of the believer is alḥamdulillāh. He gives thanks to Allah because he knows, looking at somebody else's misfortune there, that for the grace of God go I, could easily happen to me, might happen to me. And we know that from the beginning of Islam, one of the things, perhaps the thing, that most terrified the ulama and the awliya was 𝗟𝗲𝗁, was an evil sealing state. Because we are raised in accordance with the sealing state of life. That as we die, in that spiritual state, that will be our reality in the akhirah. In this world, Iman goes up and goes down. We become virtuous and sinful. But the snapshot of our spiritual journey that is going to count is the snapshot that will be, as it were, developed in the barzakh, and on the Yawm al-Qiyamah, that is what stands before the judgment seat. The last moment, which is from the Divine Mercy. Because we all want طول العمر في طاعة الله, a long life in the obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because if we use the time properly, we can accumulate a certain number of good deeds, and maybe a few of them will intercede for us. Who knows? Maybe one of those 30,000 prayers we might have said in our lives will be a good one. It's always possible. So, humility, the presence of humility, is a sure sign that somebody has understood the Seerah. That the Seerah is not just a history book that explains the circumstances by which Islam took shape and was pieced together. But the Seerah instead indicates some very profound things about the divine mind. He has revealed the Quran, وَنَجَّمَ. Certain things come first, others are subsequent. Now, I mentioned earlier that one of the consequences of this, of knowing the age, in this way, following the prophetic wisdom, not having extravagant expectations, and looking to see what is initial and primary. Is there still tawheed there? Is there still prayer of some kind? Is there still some form of generosity and virtue and kindness? Nowadays, very often we get things the other way around. Either we're not interested in those things, or we take them for granted, and we're really, really concerned to see whether the length of somebody's miswak is the approved dimensions. And that's really what seems to be central to our spiritual lives. But if we do start to see things in proportions and get our priorities right, then we will begin to be thankful for the age. And this is something that is harder because right back in the time of Imam al-Ghazali, 𝗕𝗲𝗰𝐁𝐴, certainly in the time of Imam al-Haddad, we see people are starting to complain about the age, the zaman, and of course they were right to do so. If there are fewer awliya, if there are fewer people praying properly in the mosques, if niyyah is polluted, the age is a bad one and we should complain. But لَا تَسُبُّوا الدَّهْرَ, do not curse time. Do not curse time. The times sure are bad, as we can see. No one is seriously claiming that this is one of the golden ages of faith and charity and Islamic art and all the rest of it. The times can be bad, but the dahr, time, cannot be bad insofar as it is just part of the plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, again, a consequence of reading the Seerah, looking for these clues, has to be that within our souls we make this distinction between the times and time. And that our tawheed and our tawakkul and the religious virtues, ethically, as we judge others, we look at the times. But when we frame our appreciation of the providence of our Lord, we look at time, dahr, which we've been forbidden to curse. In other words, we could say that from the, to use Imam al-Ghazali's language, in the realm of mu'amala, we use the language of the zaman, of the times. In the world of mukashafa, of unveiling and dealing with realities pertaining to tawheed, well, we're dealing with time as an inexpressible and immutable and foreordained expression of the will of the Eternal Lord. And that can't go wrong or go bad. This is an important lesson for us, I think, that we get those two things confused. We see the times as being really bad, and at some level we think we've been let down. We've been disappointed. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't let down the mu'minun. Wherever there is true faith, there is victory. Because it's his duty to give victory to the believers, and where he says alayya or alayna, it doesn't happen often in the Quran, but those places are there and are to be taken with deadly seriousness. كَتَبَ عَلَى نَفْسِهِ الرَّحْمَةِ, he has prescribed mercy upon himself. Now that's not an event in time as we would understand it. It's an expression, a particular way of stating what is his predominant quality, which is mercy. And that's not going to change. And also, وَكَانَ حَقًّا عَلَيْنَا, and it was ever a duty upon us, نَصْرُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ, to give victory to the people of Iman, to the believers. That's not going to change either. And that's why the real ulama are at ease with time, even as they lament the times. Because they see behind the scenes, they look through it, and they see the unchanging wisdom of the divine. And they know that this is not an age of manifestation purely of the jalal, of the divine rigor, because that is never uniquely expressed. There is always jamal as well, the divine beauty. And the mercy continues. The ulama continue to be with us. The fiqh continues to be intact if people want it. The whole way of Islam, the road is still open. If people want to go somewhere else, that's their business. Allah has given them that right. Allah always gives us the right to go to hell. But the As-Sirāṭul Mustaqīm, that remains open. And that's an expression not of his rigor, but of his gentleness and his generosity and his hospitality and his will that the destination of this ummah will always be the best of destinations. If we see things in that light, things start to look slightly less dark. And we start to get some tawheedic insights into why some things that we are trying don't seem to work very well. Now, this takes us back again to the tartib of events in the Seerah. What is established early on in the Meccan period? First of all, the one thing that we really can't do without, which is tawheed, la ilaha illallah. Allah doesn't say, read in the name of the Islamic movement. He says, 𝗟𝗲𝗰𝐭𝐚𝐧𝐭, read in the name of your Lord. And in that first phrase we get so much. The beginning of the Seerah in its fully sacred revelatory manifestation is so pregnant with meaning. Because we're told revelation, read. There is to be a revelation. It is to be a written revelation. He is to be its recipient, whose function is simply to repeat it. And it has a source, your Lord, the Rabb, the Lord, sustainer of all the worlds, is the one who is behind it. And everything else, every subsequent year, as the sunnah broadens and becomes richer and more multifarious and more multicoloured, and then of course after his death, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, his death in dunya continues to unfold. Every single year is under the sign of that 𝗟𝗲𝗰𝐭𝐚𝐧𝐭. And when we focus on that, then we can begin to get our heads around why he succeeded more than any other man in history, objective facts. Why he changed history more than anyone else, objective fact. Why his religion was conserved where no other religion has been conserved, another objective fact. All of these achievements that are part of the way in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is signaling to the world and to history and to anybody who pays attention the greatness of this moment, the first angelic moment of revelation. It happened, and history was divided forever into two different parts. That all of this leads on to a state of mind which is the sacred state of mind, which is what we call taqwa. That's, I suppose, the Quranic term for it. Taqwa is not an act so much as a way of being, a consciousness. And to the extent that his message began, Bismi Rabbik, he was given that categorically unequaled tawfiq. The tawfiq comes from the taqwa. So, if we get that point, to the extent that what we do comes with Bismi Rabbik, we too can hope to replicate some tiny fragment of that. وَلَا يَصْلُحُ لِهَذِهِ الْأُمَّةِ إِلَّا مَا صَلُحَ لِأَوَّلِهَا. Only that which was suitable for the first days of this ummah is suitable for the latecomers. Namely, إِخْلَاصُ النِّيَّةِ لِلَّهِ وَحْدَهُ, making the niyyah, the intention, pure for Allah alone. That this first Quranic verse indicates the primacy of niyyah in everything. Not just iqra, but there is a reason for the iqra, which is that it is for your Lord. Not for the sake of becoming a king, or acquiring a reputation, or prospering in commerce, or any of the other agrad purposes that tend to deflect human beings, but Bismi Rabbik. So if we have at the beginning of our own activities, however humble they may be, whether it be embarking on a new business, or opening a mosque, or getting married, or any of the other pursuits that are part of human life, if there is that Bismi Rabbik at the beginning of our Seerah, then there will be good things coming from it. And even where we seem to fail, there will be long-term goodness. If the niyyah is sound, then we are alright. Now, let me just go into that a little bit further, because we tend to hear a lot about niyyah, and it's become a rather mechanical sort of thing. In fact, it's the hardest thing. If salvation depends on the acceptability of our state of mind and our works, and if that acceptability depends entirely on the quality of our intention, of that brief moment of directedness, of consciousness of the qibla, of the one, then necessarily that thing must be vulnerable and difficult to get right. And if we can view the whole of the Seerah as proof of the consequences of having a proper intention, and many of the earliest events in the Seerah bespeak the extraordinary sincerity of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That his reaction was awe, humility, self-questioning, consulting with others, with Sayyidah Khadija radiallahu anha before all others. That's the sign of a sincere person. He's not going out and saying, I've had this religious experience, therefore follow me. No, he's asking himself, he's trying to figure out, what is this? If that is the reason for the splendor of the Seerah, then we need to figure out how we can somehow share in that and be continuations of that story, because if you like, the Seerah ends formally in terms of its formal events with the death of Wafat of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. But the Seerah, in a deeper sense, of course, continues, because we remain al-Ummah Muhammadiyah, and he remains attached to us, most notably through dreams. And one of the things that gives the ulama and the awliya most joy is any news that someone has beheld the presence of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in a dream, because that indicates purity of heart, or because it indicates the incipience of a powerful repentance that will inshallah bear great fruit for that individual and for his family and for his or her ummah. ما كان الله يعذبهم وأنت فيهم. Allah will not punish them while you are still amongst them. And He is sallallahu alayhi wa sallam amongst us. We're not atheists who say He is dead. As believers, we think that really nobody dies, because souls have an origin in the wisdom of the Creator, but they have no end. The soul does not die. Physical form is nothing to do with our life, really, in this substantial religious sense. So, the Seerah can, for the fortunate amongst us, still continue. The Tashri'ah has come to an end, that aspect of it. New legislation, certainly not. Those Ismaili Imams who explain how champagne turns to lemonade on their lips because they have had some new dispensation are not our way. We are precisely the people of the sunnah, and the sunnah's decisive architecture has been completed. 𝗟𝗲𝗁𝗀𝗀𝗁. The spiritual, the ta'alluq, the presence of the best of creation, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that continues. And this is a promise, and one of the greatest epics of our story is precisely those men and women who have been honoured by this direct experience of the continued life of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and whose greatest expression is to be the shafa'ah, his intercession for us at the judgment and beyond. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not deprive us of that honour and that privilege. To get back to the story, the niyyah is fundamental, and again, reading between the lines, this 𝗟𝗲𝗁𝘁 right at the beginning is like a declaration of prophetic niyyah, except that prophecy is not something he acquires. It's not like a 𝗟𝗲. It's not as if the prophet's relationship to his prophetic activities is like our relationship regarding our fasting or our praying or those things, because those are things that we acquire through kasb, and prophecy is not acquired. He says this: وَلَمْ تَكُنْ نُبُوَّةٌ مُكْتَسَبَةٌ وَلَوْ رَقَى فِي الْخَيْرِ أَعْلَى عَقَبَةٍ. And prophethood has never been acquired, even if a person should go up to the highest degree. فَذَاكَ فَضْلُ اللَّهِ يُؤْتِهِ لِمَنْ يَشَاءُ 𝗟𝗲𝗁𝗀𝗁. But that is Allah's grace, who He bestows upon whoever He wills, and glorified is He. He alone is the bestower of graces. So it's not like this ayah is a niyyah, but it is indicative of the fact that, as Imam al-Qushayri says, that they were not denied the destination except by wasting the beginning. إِنَّمَا حُرِّمُوا الْوُصُولَ لِتَضْيِيعِهِمْ الْأُصُولِ. that they were only prevented from arriving because they got the basics wrong. And this, particularly in tasawwuf, is hugely important. The first substantial spiritual encounter of the Muslim with a spiritual guide is of momentous importance. How, why, we can't guess, but there is some tremendous connection going on there, some contact between two souls that is going to establish a relationship which for the murid is likely to be decisive. And the murid continues to strive to please the shaykh, to conform, to do all of the things that the murid does. But the first moment is really what defines the nature, the quality, and the outcome of that relationship. Al-arwah junudun mujannada, that the arwah, the spirits, are marshalled armies. Now, let me just try and get a little bit deeper into this question of the niyyah. And it's again part of the glory of this ummah that it is established as science, which is really just the science of niyyat. 𝗟𝗲𝗁 could be an adequate name for the science of tasawwuf. The name tasawwuf is by no means indispensable. You can call it ihsan or irfan or suluk or tazkiyah or any of those things. It doesn't matter at all. But 𝗟𝗲𝗁 might be another way of putting it. And the purpose of this science is to engineer a better intention. And the reason why Imam al-Ghazali is the hujjah in this regard is that he is the greatest figure in our history who look back on the scriptures and agonize over their own intention. The famous moment in Imam al-Ghazali's career where he's so nervous about his intentions as he's teaching to the best pupils in the Muslim world from the minbar in Baghdad, and he starts to experience doubts about his intention. Is he doing this out of ghurur, vainglory, because he just loves having all of those students lapping up his words? Or is he really doing it for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? If you read his autobiography of 𝗟𝗲𝗁 𝗀𝗲𝗁, you'll see how powerful and painful was that anguish. He started to doubt his niyyah, and famously he fell silent in the middle of one of his lectures because he didn't feel that he could, in honesty, get another word out. And that's the mark of the real alim, that where there is no niyyah, he doesn't act. The fara'id, you act. You have no choice. But for more optional things like teaching or supererogatory devotions, if you can't get the niyyah together, if it isn't there, if it isn't given, then you don't really have to do the act. Because to pray 6 hours at night in tahajjud, if you really haven't got the right niyyah for that, you might as well stay asleep. That's better. So, let's just look at just a fragment of what Imam al-Ghazali has to say about niyyah in the Ihya Ulumuddin. And he has a section where he says, النية غير داخلة تحت الاختيار. That niyyah, intention, is not the subject of human choice. You can't choose a niyyah. And this is very important because we tend to, in a rather mechanical way, treat the niyyah as if it's just another of the rules pertaining to prayer. I've done my wudu, and now I'm in the mosque, I'm facing the qibla, and now I do my niyyah, and that's the takbiratul ihram. and so on, as if it's just another of those acts that we can choose to do at a particular time or choose to delay or whatever. But it's not like that. 𝗟𝗲𝘁'𝘀 insight is that you cannot choose to have a niyyah. You can't just get it. You can't just do it. اعلم أن الجاهل يسمع ما ذكرناه من الوصية بتحريم النية وتكثيرها مع قوله صلى الله عليه وسلم إنما الأعمال بالنيات. Know that an ignorant person might hear what I've just been talking about, about halfway through this book, about the importance of a good intention and making an intention for as many things as possible in life. And also he's saying, صلى الله عليه وسلم, actions are by intentions. فيقول في نفسه عند تدريسه أو تجارته أو أكله. And he says in himself, under his breath, when he's teaching or doing business or eating, نويت أن أدرس لله أو آكل لله. My niyyah is to teach for Allah or to eat for Allah. ويظن ذلك نية وهيهات. And he thinks that that is his niyyah, but this is absurd. فذلك حديث نفس وحديث لسان وفكر أو انتقال من خاطر إلى خاطر. That is just hadith al-nafs, the discourse of the soul, the stream of consciousness, the words and ideas that randomly come unbidden in the mind, the undisciplined mind, these thoughts just go on and on, have no particular direction. And he's saying that sort of niyyah is just the same as that hadith al-nafs. And it's hadith lisan, it's something that you make your tongue conform to. And it's just an idea, or just a movement from one state of mind to another. وَالنِّيَّةُ بِمَعْزِلٍ مِّن جَمِيعِ ذَلِكَ. But the niyyah is something completely different from any of that. وَإِنَّمَا النِّيَّةُ إِنْبِعَاثُ النَّفْسِ وَتَوَجُّهُهَا وَمَيْلُهَا إِلَى مَا ظَهَرَ لَهَا أَنَّ فِيهِ قَرَرُهَا إِمَّا عَاجِلًا وَإِمَّا آجِلًا. The niyyah is simply the nafs, the soul, the self, arising and orienting itself and being inclined to whatever seems to satisfy its purposes in the short or the long term. That's the niyyah. And then he goes on to deepen this analysis. And he says, to say that you are about to pray or you're about to teach for Allah, and just doing that mechanically and thinking that that's it, and even if you have it in your mind that that's why you're doing it, that's your purpose, that's not a niyyah, he says. That's just another mechanical process. He says, it's just like قول الشبعان نويت أن أشتهي الطعام وأميل إليه. It's just like a person who's stuffed full of food saying, my niyyah now is to be hungry. That's, he says, not a niyyah. If that's not really your state, that's not a niyyah. Even if you say it, you're conscious of it, you know this is what you should be doing, whatever. It's not a niyyah. أو قول الفارغ نويت أن أعشق فلانا وأحبه وأعظمه بقلبه. Or the statement of somebody who's not romantically attached. My intention is to fall in love with somebody and love that person and adore that person with my heart. If your heart isn't really in that state, then the niyyah is not really a niyyah at all. It's just a noise, it's just a meaningless utterance. فَذَلِكَ مُحَالٌ, that is impossible. بل لا طريق إلى اكتساب صرف القلب إلى الشيء وميله إليه وتوجهه نحوه إلا باكتساب أسبابه. In fact, there is no way to acquiring the movement of the heart to something, and it's inclining to something, and it's being directed to something, unless you acquire the reasons for that reorientation. وَذَلِكَ مِمَّا قَدْ يَقْدِرُ عَلَيْهِ وَقَدْ لَا يَقْدِرُ عَلَيْهِ. And that is something that a person might be able to do or might not be able to do. So, and then he goes on and he explains that It is therefore all about your spiritual condition. You cannot force yourself to have a really, really first-rate A1 intention for your tahajjud prayer. You can't force yourself to do that. However disciplined your brain might be, however completely you keep away other thoughts while you're framing that niyyah, however perfectly you might articulate it in Arabic or any other language, it isn't a niyyah at all unless it's really expressing the fact that this is what you really want to do. Either because that's what you want to do for spiritual upliftment at the moment, or to please Allah for favours in the akhirah. So really to work on the niyyah means nothing less than working on the soul, dealing with its sicknesses. And then he gets into some of the apparently eccentric behaviour of the early ulama, who were so concerned not to waste their time by doing things for which they didn't have a niyyah, that sometimes they wouldn't do it. If they did, for instance, it's said of Ibn Sirin, one of the famous 𝗕𝗲𝗰𝐻𝗃, that he didn't attend the janazah of Al-Hasan al-Basri. It might seem strange. And he was asked, why not? He said, لَمْ تَحْضُرَنِي النِّيَّةِ. The intention wasn't right for me, I couldn't get the intention. He knew if he'd gone, without that intention being clear, it wouldn't have been really attending the janazah. He wouldn't have discharged the obligation. It would have been purely formal. It's quite a high degree. And a number of the early ulama in hadith in particular, like Imam Tawus bin Kaysan, who was the Imam of the Tabi'een in Mecca for hadith. Many of his hadith in the by Imam Bukhari and others. His pupils sometimes found it quite frustrating because sometimes they would come to him at the time for that hadith class and he would say, "La tahduruni niyya." The intention hasn't come right for me. I don't have the intention. And there would be no class. At other times, when it wasn't the time for the class, he would suddenly start spouting hadith. And everybody would come and start writing them down, because that was when the intention came. And he recognized this was from the word of the waqt, from the time, a particular time from which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given him this idhn for this gift of a sound intention. And that's the sign of real sincerity and real intelligence in religion. That it isn't just some kind of mechanical process, because that's not worthy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is looking at where we are spiritually. What we are doing with our bodies is of no account. He judges our hearts. The qalb salim, the sound heart, is that which is useful to us at the qiyamah, as the Quran expresses. And this is in fact is the only way of making sense of religion, otherwise it just becomes a kind of formalism, like the worst stereotypes of rabbinical Judaism. It's just a whole load of rules in order to be properly part of the group and to be pleasing to a God who's so distant that he might as well not exist, but he gives you these rules and regulations that you have to stick to. No, that's not the way a religion with a sharia operates. And niyyah is everything. Now, does it mean that you can't pray zuhr if you don't have the niyyah? No. Because the niyyah will always be there for the righteous person, for something like that, for something fundamental. And Imam al-Ghazali goes on to say that actually these states are quite unusual. And that the person of khayr, of goodness, is likely to have a soul which makes him automatically inclined towards these good acts. These are exceptional circumstances that Ibn Sirin once just didn't have the niyyah, so he didn't go, and he was right. But generally, the closer you are to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the easier it is for the niyyah to be given to you, and you act on a regular basis. And of course, one of the purposes of having the ibadat is to clean up the heart. The prayer does forbid the fahsha and the munkar, the evil and the disreputable act. The prayer is like washing 5 times a day in the river outside your house. Each time you do it, if you do it properly, you're a little bit better. It's a stage. It's like a mi'raj. It's the mi'raj al-mu'min. You go up. a little bit more, and you try to ensure that in the intervening 4 hours before the next prayer, you don't go back to the same point, but you go perhaps back to a point that's slightly higher. And that's the effort, that's the whole effort of religion. Make a tiny infinitesimal movement forward between each prayer, and then it's a salatu ila salat, and the Jumu'ah ila Jumu'ah, and the Jumu'ah to the Jumu'ah, and then the Ramadan to the Ramadan, and you're making progress. And then the niyyah becomes easier. Until you find, and this is the way of the Anbiya, and this is again one of the glories of the Seerah, that the niyyah for an act of ta'ah and obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just comes. And a niyyah for an act of dunya is something you really have to make an effort to bring about. It's hard to make a niyyah to go to the shopping centre is for the real believer an effort. It doesn't come naturally, it's a drag. But to go to the mosque for the believer, alhamdulillah, the niyyah is constant. His qalb is muta'allaq bil masajid. His heart is linked to the mosques. And to the extent that that is our niyyah, and the extent to which things come easily to us, we are the people of Iman, and we are not the people of nifaq. The Turks, in the month of April, speak a lot of the rain. It's a rainy season in much of Turkey, as in England, I suppose. And they say that the sharia is like the rain in April, because it falls in different places. And the sharia and these actions, where they descend upon, where they are divinely gifted to, the rose garden, produce the buds and the roses and the fragrance that brings the earth into a kind of anticipation of Allah's garden. But when the rain falls on the dunghill, it makes it stink. And the dunghill is the state of the munafiq, and the lazy person, and the one who's really on the edge and not doing things at all. The sharia for him is some kind of strange, unnatural rearrangement of life that gets in the way of the important pleasures for which his niyyah becomes so easy. But for the believer, when the rain comes, well, the rose garden has just been waiting for it, and it becomes more itself, and it flowers, and it attracts people. The quality of the true believer, as he receives and implements the sharia, and in all of these spiritual respects, women, men, no difference at all, is that people's hearts incline towards that person. People get the 𝗿𝗲𝗴𝘂𝗃𝐽, the fragrance of the rose garden, and they want to go in, they want to spend time there. Because they detect in the presence of those who have been reshaped by the sharia some recollection of how people were at the Ruzi Alast, the day of Alastu bi Rabbikum, am I not your Lord? And that himma, that yearning, that haneen, that nostalgia is activated. Everybody has some dim recollection of that moment, not a discursive recollection, but at some deep level. Everybody is potentially spiritual. And when they see the saint who shows the glory of the sharia and the sunnah, they're naturally inclined towards that person. But of course, when they walk past the dunghill, same sharia is there, same rules are applicable to everybody. They're repelled, they hold their noses and they run away shrieking. Which means that da'wah, again another fundamental dimension of the seerah, another dimension that certainly didn't come to an end when he died, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, because the absent is required to convey, drawing his knowledge from the present. The da'wah depends on whether we are rose gardens or dunghills as we receive the sharia. And if our hearts are full of resentment and jealousy and suspicion and frustration and panic and general lack of taslim, of submission to Allah's decree, then we may well have the sharia, but everybody is going to be saying, yuck, Islamic fundamentalism, those guys again, and they'll run away. And that is proof that they are not the proper recipients of sharia. When the rose garden starts to burst into bloom, when people start saying, MashaAllah, the Islamic State, and people, instead of running away from it, want to go to it, people of all types, because they find that there is justice and there is sincerity, then the sharia is being actualized. It's the same sharia, but it's the soil on which it's descending. What is the human raw material? Imam al-Ghazali begins the Ihya with the hadith, الناس معادن كمعادن الذهب والفضة. People are mines like mines of gold and silver. فخيارهم في الجاهلية خيارهم في الإسلام إذا فقهوا. And the best of them in Jahiliyyah, once they have understanding. So there were people of honor in the Jahiliyyah like Hatim al-Ta'i who were praised by the Prophet ﷺ. They had good qualities. And had they been Muslim, they would have been amongst the giants of the Sahaba. Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anh, he had the virtue of muruwah, of warriorhood in the Jahiliyyah, and he became the second of the Khulafa and the great Imam of Amr bil Ma'ruf in Islam. Upon him, the rain fell, and because of the quality of the soil, he became what he became. Now, this should be the lens through which we view our communities, our countries, our organizations, our movements. Are they viewed by passers-by as dunghills, only attractive to people who are of that nature themselves? Or are they viewed as places of fragrance that everybody wants to visit? It is not enough to say, well, the non-Muslims, just a bunch of kafirs, so of course they don't want to come and see what's happening in the Masjid. We don't have a doctrine of original sin so that we can say they are not capable of rational or moral judgment. If we said that nobody who is not Muslim is capable of rational or moral judgment, then the Quran would have had no means to address the people of the Jahiliyyah. People do have a tamyiz, they do have an ability to see right from wrong, to intuit goodness and selflessness, and to see its difference from evil and stupidity. And we need, particularly those of us who are living in the West, to ask ourselves some very sharp and deep and painful questions about how successful our rose gardens have been. Are our mosques and our community centres little oases of light and sanity and hospitality and forgiveness? Or are they thorn bushes where nobody in their right mind would seek an answer to their questions or a healing to their wounds? Well, we only need to look around. How many people do come in? How many people come into the mosque just to sit down and to feel at peace? Not a lot. Partly because their experience may be that as soon as they do it, somebody with an extraordinarily long growth of beard for such a small man rushes over and tells them to get out, or hands them some nasty little tracts in bad English with pink and green characters on the cover, telling them 99 different ways of getting to hell. No, that tends to be what we do, and again, I meet people who come to me as an academic, and they say they've been to the mosque and somebody shouted at them, or the place was dirty, or everybody seemed bad-tempered, or whatever, and they couldn't figure it out. And often for people who have come to Islam recently, that's a real trial. That's often the biggest trial that they experience. Well, where is the rose garden, which means, using this language, where is the right reception of the rain of heaven? Is it really an oasis in the middle of the desert? Or do people experience it as a little desert in the middle of an oasis? Do they feel more relaxed in the shopping centre or in Burger King than they do at the mosque? Whether they're Muslims or not. Well, how do we get back to that? And Imam al-Ghazali's diagnosis is as deep and as worrying as it is clear. He says implicitly, go back to the Seerah and see the beginning point of it. Everything must be Bismi Rabbik, not Bismi Harakatik or Bismi Jama'atik or Bismi Nafsik. Everything must be in the name of your Lord, with all of that implies your own sense of helplessness and your own sense of worthlessness and your own refusal to blame other people for being the way they happen to be. When that comes, when the mosque becomes a place of self-accusation and giving other people the benefit of the doubt, then the mosque can be what Medina became. The oasis in the middle of the warring, fitna-ridden madness of pagan Arabia. So people would come, the wafud would come from far away from Bahrain, Oman, because they saw that here was something new. For centuries they'd been at each other's throats because all they knew was the wild barbarism of the honour code. Here was something new in Arabia, a place where people, irrespective of tribal affiliation, irrespective of gender, could be genuinely at peace. Where did the waft, the delegation of the Bishop of Najran go? They were invited to the Holy of Holies, to Masjid al-Nabawi, to the Mosque of the Prophet ﷺ, when they came. The mosque, the haram, one of the meanings of haram is that it's a sanctuary. According to many of the fuqaha, even if a non-Muslim seeks asylum in the haram, you still have to give him food and drink until he leaves of his own free will. It's one of the meanings of haram, it is a sanctuary. And this is from the prayer of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam for the first haram, ij'al hadha al-balada amina, make this land secure. And one of the many unfolding miracles of the Haramain is that that actually did take place. If you fly over the Hijaz, you'll see why the Hijaz is called Hijaz, which means barrier. It's inaccessible. Getting there from the east, well, nobody in their right mind would come there from the east, because to the east there's just wild tribes. From the coast, well, there are mountains. From the south there are mountains. From the north there are certainly mountains. Medina is surrounded 4/5 of its perimeter with the Harrat of lava plains, which made life so difficult for the invading armies of Quraysh, who were the only invading armies, non-Muslim armies, ever to get near to the Haram. And the Red Sea itself has the most treacherous currents. It was always regarded as one of the most dangerous places in the world for navigation. It's like a kind of Sargasso Sea. And the Ottomans placed a garrison in Jeddah because they thought that the Portuguese, who are causing trouble all down the coasts of Africa and India, were going to make a bid for the Haramain. And indeed, the Duke of Albuquerque, who sacked and destroyed Goa and turned it into India's only Christian city, led a fleet of galleys over the Arabian Sea and up the Red Sea in the early 16th century, specifically with the intention of sacking Mecca and Medina and destroying the mosques. And he was defeated by the Red Sea. He never saw the Ottoman garrison or the Ottoman fleet. He couldn't get inshore. So treacherous and so difficult were those currents that many of his galleys were actually wrecked, and he returned disconsolate. Well, that's one of Allah's ayat, or his signs, that he has kept those lands amin. And inside, what are they to be? Inside, they're to be rose gardens. They should be magnets for people who need to be at peace. And this, of course, is what Islam also did in the third of the Haramain, in Jerusalem. In the Gospels, we learn that Sayyidina Isa 𝗟𝗲𝗁 made the dua regarding the temple, that the temple shall be made a house of prayer to all nations. And that has only taken place under Islam. For Judaism, it was the Jewish nation who used it. Under the Byzantine Christians, it was turned into a rubbish heap. Only in Islam is that prophecy being fulfilled, and it was historically a place where people of the Abrahamic religions could come and pray, be at peace, and be themselves. And that's part of our expression of the Abrahamic hospitality. And this is what happens when the rain of heaven falls on the land that deserves it, on receptive ground. Where people are open, relaxed, humble, accuse themselves, give other people the benefit of the doubt, and adopt all of those other splendid akhlaq that were the qualities of the Sahaba, then Nasrul Mu'mineen, the victory of the believers, becomes a sure thing. وَأَنْتُمُ الْأَعْلَوْنَ إِن كُنْتُمْ مُؤْمِنِينَ. You shall be uppermost if you have Iman. So an Islamic movement is not an Islamic movement if it fails. Okay, it can have ups and downs for a while, but if it consistently fails, it's not an Islamic movement. And I don't care what it claims to be, what its doctrine might be. If it fails again and again and again and brings merely misfortune to members, for other Muslims and for the world generally, it's not an Islamic movement. Because Allah has promised victory to those who have real Iman and real niyyah. And all too often these hizbs and jama'as and factions that we see running around these days are there simply to wave the banner of their own frustrated egos. They're not really about 𝗪𝗲𝗪, Allah's word is the uppermost. They are about trumpeting their frustration to the world, like a child screaming in a school playing field, begging for attention. That's what they're up to, and that is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never humiliate the sharia by allowing them success. The flip side of that is that success is possible, but it is possible only when the usul are correct, when the niyyah is correct, when everything is Bismi Rabbik alladhi khalaq, the name of your Lord who created. And that's the message of the Seerah. It's the greatest success story. Nobody can imagine a story of comparable success from any civilization. From the most unpromising beginnings, we get, in a couple of decades, a phenomenon that transforms the most improbable people on earth and turns them into the springboard from which the ancient world learns tawheed and itself becomes a flourishing garden, not just for Muslims, but for Jews, Christians and others, so that people sought refuge amongst the Muslims, so that Muslim conquerors were welcomed, so that Islamic law and the Islamic order were regarded as truly rain from heaven, rather than simply as a banner on which we inscribe of our own personal grievances. Now, that's been a set of rather loose generalizations about the large structure of the Seerah. I want to think perhaps people will have a few questions, and I hope that we'll be able to confine ourselves to questions relating to the points I've been making, but since we have a little bit more time, and I take it that the adhan will be at 6 o'clock, is that correct?
35 minutes.
In 35 minutes from now, okay. I've had the honour to mention the name of Imam 𝗿𝗲𝗴𝘂𝗂 𝗿𝗲𝗵 radiallahu anhu, and I want to go through one of his qasidas, and I will mildly apologise to those of you who don't know Arabic, and this will be an inspiration to you to learn a bit more. But the barakah is inshallah in the original even more than it is in the translation. And I think that is encapsulating at least some of the insights that are characteristic of the calm and collected and balanced way of the Bani Alawi. بشر فؤادك بالنصيب الوافي بشر فؤادك بالنصيب الوافي من قرب ربك واسع الألطاف من قرب ربك واسع الألطاف الواحد الملك العظيم فلذ به الواحد الملك العظيم فلذ به واشرب من التوحيد كأسا صافي واشرب من التوحيد كأسا صافي واشهد جمالا أشرقت أنواره واشهد جمالا أشرقت أنواره في كل شيء ظاهرا لا خافي في كل شيء ظاهرا لا خافي وعلى بناص الجمع متخليان وعلى بناص الجمع متخليان عن كل فان للتفرق نافي عن كل فان للتفرق نافي والباس لرب العرش في أقداره والباس لرب العرش في أقداره ثوبا من التسليم وفي الضعف ثوبا من التسليم وفي الضعف واستغفر ربك كل أمر إنه واستغفر ربك كل أمر إنه سبحانه البر اللطيف الكافي سبحانه البر اللطيف الكافي واسأله أن يلبسك ثوب إنابة واسأله أن يلبسك ثوب إنابة وهداية وسلامة وعوافٍ وهداية وسلامة وعوافٍ واشكر على النعماء واصبر للبلاء واشكر على النعماء واصبر للبلاء وتحل بالإفضال والإنصاف وتحل بالإفضال والإنصاف وعليك بالإخلاص والصدق وعليك بالإخلاص والصدق وبالزهد وجانب منكر الأوصاف زهدي وجانب منكر الأوصاف واستصحب التقوى وكن ذا همة واستصحبه التقوى وكن ذا همة وفتوة وأمانة وعفاف وفتوة وأمانة وعفاف وأنير إلى دار الكرامة والبقاء وأنير إلى دار الكرامة والبقاء وأنير دنية كن أخي متجافي وأنير دنية كن أخي متجافي والزم كتاب الله واتبع سنتان والزم كتاب الله واتبع سنتان واقتد هداك الله بالأسلاف واقتد هداك الله بالأسلاف أهل اليقين لعينه ولحاقه أهل اليقين لعينه ولحاقه وصلوا وثم جواهر الأصداف وصلوا وثم جواهر الأصداف راح اليقين أعز مشروب لنا راح اليقين أعز مشروب لنا فشرب وطب وسكر بخير سلاف فشرب وطب وسكر بخير سلاف هذا شراب القوم سادتنا وكاد هذا شراب القوم سادتنا وكاد أخطأ طريقة من يكن بخلاف أخطأ طريقة من يكن بخلاف بشر فؤادك بالنصيب وافي بشر فؤادك بالنصيب الوافي من قرب ربك واسع الألطاف من قرب ربك واسع الألطاف. That's one of his most comprehensive qasaid. If you're familiar with the diwan of Abdal Haddad, you'll know that he recognizes the distractedness of the people of his times and counsels them to some of the most elemental prophetic virtues, the tawheedic virtues, particularly the virtues of sabr and of rida. He sees these as being the necessary qualities of the believer in a time of decay, of slackening. Let me just translate this for you. Give your hearts the good news of a generous share of closeness to your Lord, wasi' al-altafi, whose subtleties, whose gifts, whose graces are abundant. Don't underestimate the ni'am of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because they are all His ata and they are too numerous to be imagined. Imam 𝗟𝗲𝗁 𝗂𝐴 has the famous qasida, إن العطاء إمداده متنوع يا حسن هذا كالعطاء المتنوع. The gifts, Allah's gifts, are of many kinds. How beautiful is the diversity of the gifts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And note that Imam Haddad says here, Rabbik, this is like obviously Rabbik, the name of your Lord, you have no other Lord, everything that you have, the few things for which you give thanks, and the millions of things for which we do not give thanks, including the faithful organs within our bodies, and the process by which the rain falls, all of that is just as deserving of Allah's thanks, and these are from His 𝗟𝗲𝗁 al-Ta'af, His the broad canvas of His subtle gifts and His graces. So you think, 𝗟𝗲𝗁 𝗂𝗍𝗂, give your heart good news. A Lord who has given you this extraordinary universe with all of these ni'am, all of these blessings, by which is your being and your sustenance, and which give you so much hope and so much delight. The good news is the proximity of your Lord. This is the greatest thing for which anybody can be given good news. And who is He? Al-Wāḥid, Al-Malik, Al-Azim, one, the King, the Mighty, 𝗲𝗲𝗰𝐂𝐽𝐽, so seek refuge in Him. And a need that can only be healed through tawheed. Resolving the many to the one is the fundamental act of healing, which is the purpose of revelation and of prophecy. The Shafi, the healer, is precisely the one who brings tawheed. Only when we can see, as well as we can, that there is a unitive source behind the perplexing multiplicity of things in dunya, can we really be at peace. بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبُ. By the recollection of Allah, our hearts made serene. And there is no other source, really, for the tranquility of hearts. This tuma'nina, this sakina, comes only from tawheed, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because otherwise there is only more multiplicity. And interpreting phenomena in terms of other phenomena that then require interpretation in terms of other phenomena just leaves you on and on wandering in the desert, and it has no limit. And that's what the scientists do, and that's what everybody does in the materialist civilization. There is no healing there. They're not made better. They're not made more serene. It's just a question that is answered by another question. But tawheed gives you the complete picture. Al-Wāḥid, Al-Malik, Al-Azim, one, the King, the Almighty. 𝗲𝗲𝗰𝐂𝐽𝐽, seek refuge in Him, not anywhere else. وَاشْهَدْ جَمَالًا أَشْرَقَتْ أَنْوَارُهُ فِي كُلِّ شَيْءٍ ظَاهِرًا لَا خَافِي. And then witness, washhad, a beauty whose lights shine in everything, manifest and not hidden. What does that mean? The beauty, the jamal of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, once you have this insight of tawheed, once you know that everything has a single divine author and architect, then it starts to be illuminated. And then you start to gain the attribute of the wali, who is the one who is taken out of the shadows into the light. And then you start to see everything as a signpost, as an ayah, as something that celebrates with tasbih the glory and wisdom of its creator. And that's the difference between the wali and the ordinary human being. The ordinary human being sees forms mediated just by shadows, doesn't see the light. But the wali perceives the light, and therefore makes sense of the shadows and can see that everything has a unitive source. Allahu waliyyu alladhina amanu yukhrijuhum min adh-dhulumati ila an-nur. Allah is the protecting friend of those who have Iman. He takes them out of the shadows into the light. And the channel by which this takes place is the channel of prophecy, and the recognition that the signs in Revelation and in the world are true signs. وعلى منص الجمع قف متخليا عن كل فان للتفرق نافي. And on the platform of togetherness, unification, stand at that high degree, absent from everything that passes away, denying the tafarruq, From our perspective, as little insects creeping around at the lowest level of the orders of being, diversity we take to be something that is real in itself. But the real tawheedic perspective is that things are not real in themselves, they are only real by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He has created the heavens and the earth bil haqq. Their sustenance is only through Him. He is the only one who is qayyum. He is the only one who is samad. He is the only one who is ghani. Everything else is in a state of dependence. Everything else is faqir, absolutely dependent upon Him. And that's the difference. Self-subsistent, the necessary existent, 𝗲𝗲𝗰𝐁𝐻, and everything else which is just mumkin, just possible. And when you are at this high degree of tawheed, he says, following spiritual exercises and following full implementation of everything that has been brought, internally and externally, in the sunnah of Sayyidina Muhammad ﷺ, then you look at the world with different eyes. And that's why the wali smiles a lot. That's why nobody smiled more than Sayyidina Muhammad ﷺ, as Ma'bad said. Nobody smiled more than him. Nobody carried more burdens of history than he did, and suffered calamities in his life. The death of his wife, the orphanhood, the death of his daughters, deaths of his friends, sickness, calamities that he had to bear, far more than we could ever expect to carry. But he smiled. Why? Because he is precisely this kind of tawheedic person that sees what we see, but the meaning is different. The surah is the same, but the ma'na is quite different. We see things that depend on each other, asbab that are locked into a single system. But the person of tawheed sees everything as not interacting with each other, essentially, but only being the direct creation of Allah's creative omnipotence and will. Because every moment, and every phenomenon, every moment is there only by the decree of its Lord. This is a necessary consequence of tawheed. Act A does not produce Act B. Act B may follow Act A conventionally through what we call ādah, because Allah has decreed that the world will appear to follow certain fixed rules, although there are khawariq, miracles of various kinds, in which things just as naturally do things differently. The moon is split, there's a revelation, thousands of people are fed, there is a mi'raj, all of that. But nonetheless there is normally an ādah. But the reality is everything, every movement of every atom is directly ordained by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the true tawheed. That's where we differ from other religions, where they say God does some things, but other things genuinely are part of a world that is like a clock that's been wound up and ticks and isn't dependent in every instant on direct divine action. That we would describe as a form of ثانوية, or dualism, that there are two agents, two creative agents in creation, and we don't go for that. So this is nafy al-tafarruq in Imam al-Haddad's language, the denial of the ontological reality of the diversity of being and existence. It's diverse only in the sense that our five senses perceive it as diverse and interacting with each other, but in fact it is all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all equally the obedient, submissive consequence of His perpetual command. So, وَالْبَسْلِ رَبِّ الْعَرْشِ فِي أَقْدَارِهِ ثَوْبًا مِنَ التَّسْلِيمِ ظَافٍ. And then, where, before the Lord of the throne, with regard to His decrees, a garment of submissiveness that is broad and covers you. Those are the robes of honor which the believer must wear. Complete submission, which is Islam itself. Taslim, Islam, it's the same thing. Submission to the omnipotent, knowing that He alone is King, and that any engagement with anything else, any other principle, is merely a way of dealing with Him according to the adab and the adat that He has set up in this complex web that we call the created world. But everything, depending on the niyyah, is ultimately for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we need to wear this garment, and that's what the Muslim does with the sharia and with revelation. He's not a naked savage, he is the person of dignity. He's not the one who screams himself black in the face at a rally about some political cause in which he believes. He has taslim, rida. dignity is the watchword of the real Muslim. He is in a state of self-possession. He accepts the decrees of his Lord. وَاسْتَغْفِرْ رَبَّكَ كُلَّ هَمٍّ إِنَّهُ سُبْحَانَهُ 𝗲𝗲𝗁𝗂𝗏. And know that your Lord is enough in dealing with every anxiety. However worried you might be, don't really worry, because your Lord is enough. He is al-Kafi. Subhanahu 𝗲𝗲𝗁𝗂𝗏. Glory to Him. He is the good, the subtle, the sufficient. If you know that He is those things, deep down, there is no cause for anxiety. If you are submitting in the state of Islam, then the calamities of the world are to be dealt with through grief, through sadness, at the top of the heart. But deep down, there is taslim. Because to object, to have jaza', is to reject the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there is not going to be any other decree. Things could not have fallen out other than the way they are. And this is, again, part of Imam al-Haddad's particular emphasis for people in an age of fitna and misfortune and slackening. It is all part of the divine wisdom. Wear that robe, don't run around like a savage. وَاسْأَلْهُ أَنْ يُلْبِسْكَ ثَوْبَ إِنَابَةٍ وَهِدَايَةٍ وَسَلَامَةٍ وَعَوَافٍ. And ask him to bestow upon you a garment of inaba, which is humble repentance, whereas in Ibrahim alayhi salam, and guidance and well-being and security. وَاشْكُرْ عَلَى النَّعْمَاءِ وَاصْبِرْ لِلْبَلَى وَتَحَلَّ بِالْإِفْضَالِ وَالْإِنصَافِ. And then again, the same point, the necessary virtues, once you have this tawheedic perspective, are give thanks for the blessings and be patient where there are trials and afflictions, and adorn yourself with generosity and balance, objectivity, insaf. Be a person of the middle. Don't dive madly into the ni'am. Don't become a person of dunya. But don't be a person of jaza' who is panicking when there are trials and when things of dunya are taken away from him. See how you are, whether you have sabr in times of misfortune and shukr in times of gratitude, and that's the way of istiqamah, the middle way, not to go to either of the two extremes. And that is the consequence only of this true perspective of tawheed, which is urging upon us. If you have that certainty, that yaqeen, that everything is from Him, nothing will affect us except that which He has prescribed for us, then you will have these virtues. Sabr and shukr are only present in those who truly have that yaqeen. وَعَلَيْكَ بِالْإِخْلَاصِ وَالصِّدْقِ وَبِالزُّهْدِ وَجَانِبْ مُنْكَرَ الْأَوْصَافِ. And you must acquire sincerity and honesty and zuhd, doing without. Don't be a fanatic for dunya because you can't get more than a fraction of it. Nobody's ever had more than a fraction of it. People long to have that which Qarun had, or something similar to that which Qarun had, but it didn't do him any good. Wealth, the oldest cliche of all religious life, doesn't generally bring happiness. Zuhud, doing without, but not to the extent of fanatic austerity. That too is not appropriate. In our times in particular, the ulama emphasized that we should have decent jobs and respectable careers, because this is a way of honouring Islam by showing us as a middle community that is useful to society, rather than hanging out at the dole office with the less successful members of society. We are required to work. The hand that gives is always better than the hand that takes, and it is inappropriate that the hand that gives should be a non-Muslim hand and the hand that takes should be a Muslim hand. This is against the natural order of things. وَجَانِبْ مُنْكَرَ الْأَوْصَافِ. And avoid disreputable, disgusting characteristics, such as lying and sloth and laziness and harbouring ill opinions of other people. وَاسْتَصْحِبِ التَّقْوَى وَكُنْ ذَا هِمَّةٍ وَفُتُوَّةٍ وَأَمَانَةٍ وَعَفَافٍ. Keep the company of taqwa and be a person of himmah, high aspiration. It's very important that ulul himmah, that Muslims should have high aspiration. He should aspire for the pleasure of his Lord, that's a high aspiration. He should aspire to the Jannah, to the garden, which is 𝗟𝗲𝗁𝐴𝐻𝐻𝐵, Allah's expensive trading goods. That he should aspire to be amongst the awliya, and the salihin, and the siddiqeen, and the ulama. He should have a himmah to become a person of ilm, that he should know certainly what is obligatory upon him in the fiqh and doctrine of the religion, and then should continue to learn things, particularly those things that are likely to be of benefit to those who are around him, or of benefit to him in certain circumstances that he or she might come across. وَفُطُوَّةٍ وَأَمَانَةٍ وَعَفَافٍ. Futuwa is this virtue that we particularly associate with Imam Ali radiallahu anhu. Sword has 2 points, reflecting the 2 jihads, the Jihad al-Akbar and the Jihad al-Asghar, which in fact are 2 aspects of the same thing, where one is present, the other is not far away. If there is real spiritual victory against the lower possibilities of the self, then that person will be uplifted to a state where he takes pity on the sufferings of others and will wish to raise the sword in order to defend the weak and the orphan and the poor. Necessarily the one leads to the other. Simultaneously, if the jihad of the sword is real with taqwa, it has to go side by side with the other point of the sword. If the jihad is to be made with a correct niyyah, and it's not just to be, as it so often can be, a means of increasing the amount of fitna on the earth. Very often, movements that claim to be engaged in jihad nowadays seem to have the consequence of simply increasing the amount of misery, misfortune and poverty and division and death amongst Muslims, and seem very often simply to be serving the interests of our enemies. That takes place because the other jihad, the jihad against the nafs, has not been properly embarked upon, so it just becomes nafs, the ego, bearing the sword, rather than the spirit doing so. وأنب إلى دار الكرامة والبقاء وعن الدنية كن أخي متجافٍ. And incline towards the abode of honor and perpetuity, and turn aside, my brother, from the daniyah, the lower thing. This is from a hadith. And وَلْزَمْ كِتَابَ اللَّهِ وَاتْبَعْ سُنَّةً, and stick firmly to the book of Allah and follow the sunnah. وَاقْتَدْ اللَّهُ بِالْأَسْلَافِ, and follow the footsteps of the salaf. May Allah guide you, not just outwardly, but inwardly as well. Following the guidance of the accredited ulama, not trying to work it out for yourself. أهل اليقين لعينه ولحقه وصلوا وثم جواهر الأصداف. They are the people of certainty, the people of its ayn and of its haqq, and there are different degrees of yaqeen, and if we had more time I might offer some reflections on that. Different degrees of yaqeen, as we all know. There is the yaqeen of hearing from somebody reliable that there is a place called Vladivostok. And then there is the yaqeen, which is a degree of meeting somebody from Vladivostok. And then there is the experience of seeing it from a distance, perhaps from the plane. And then the experience of actually being there, being one of its citizens, and really knowing what it is. And those are different degrees of yaqeen. So it is in our knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and knowledge of things of religion. As we progress in our irtiqa, in our sayr ilallah, our progress and our movement back towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in our own personal mi'raj, as the heart becomes clearer, and the eye of the heart starts to open, then the degree of yaqeen increases. This is the experience of all the salikin. راح اليقين أعز مشروب لنا فاشرب وطب واسكر بخير The wine of certainty is the most delicious drink that we could have, so drink and enjoy it and become intoxicated with this best of wines. And again is one of the states of the wali when he's completely in a state of certainty, this high degree of haqq al-yaqeen. He is usually a jolly and a relaxed person. He is not stern and false and khadis al-qalb, judgmental and jabbing an angry finger at people and blaming people. No, he's relaxed. And he guides people indirectly and privately, rather than by thundering from the minbar. And وَاسْكَرْ بِخَيْرِ الصُّلَافِ, Jalaluddin Rumi says, مَارَدِ خُدَى مَسْتُبَى فِي شَرَابٍ. The man of Allah is intoxicated without wine, because wine is from corruption. It's not purity, it's not pure substance. Fermentation is a kind of corruption. And the person of yaqeen has a different form of intoxication, which is that all of the perplexity of the world that troubled him for so long, all of that lack of clarity is now gone, and he sees how things really are, and he's so delighted that he's almost punch-drunk with the pleasure and the delight. Again, this is why the awliya and iyad so often seem to smile. 𝗿𝗲𝗁 𝗂𝐴 𝗟𝗲𝗁 𝗂𝐴. This is the drink of the people, Sadatuna, our masters, and whoever says otherwise has departed from the correct way. If you do religion in any other spirit, you'll just be part of the darknesses. You'll be part of the tawheed. Even if you hold up a banner of religion, even if you furiously think you adhere to the sunnah in every last detail, you can be just as much part of the shadows, land of darknesses, as Fir'aun and Qarun. And you can even be worse, because for you the possibility of nifaq also applies. You can be genuinely a force of turbulence. And Al-Masih al-Dajjal, the false Messiah, may Allah keep us safe from him and his fitna, is precisely the one who emulates the correctness. Astaghfirullah li wa lakum.